going to get started. Thank you. I've got a microphone to make it official. Thank you all for coming to ACAT today. I don't think it's the last ACAT we're having this year. Yeah, Hera's coming, and then I think we've got two more. Okay. Well, there's more anyway. So, thanks for coming today. Kim Scott, is this the item, sustainable yield? We'll be talking with us about sustainable yield. And I'm just going to hand over to Kim, who requires no introduction.
Very smooth.
Oh, it's not showing on the screen. Sorry.
I'll start talking, even if we're not on the screen. I'll begin. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the fact that we're
Brothers
on.
country, and he made us welcome.
Well,
I want the Wirlomin tribe to know and to read
that's
his
one of those
story to
videos
us.
that got parked down there.
It's so precious.
It's Auntie interrupting my welcome to country, putting nothing into that. So Willem and Noongar, she's just getting a bit of rivalry out. Yes, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to Whadjuk Noongar people. Acknowledge we're on Whadjuk Noongar Budja. Pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Possibly particularly pertinent because what I'll be talking about today. I also need to put out a warning that there'll be lots of images of people who are deceased in the what I'm hoping will be here. Is it clear enough? From where you are? Turn the lights off or do something about that. There'll be a lot of this sort of hesitation and anxiety about technology today. Even though I'm in part talking about an ARC project that has technologies in the title. And it is a very, I know it's a very bland title page here. That's partly because of my own ineptness. But it's also because this is a draft sort of thing, very casual, very informal, and I thought it'd be appropriate to have it as if I'd just scribbled it on a whiteboard or something like that. The title, Sustainable Yield, is a couple of words, is a phrase I've stolen from Steve Hopper, who is an ecological expert, perhaps is the term, does a lot of work along the south coast of WA. I'm not using it quite the way that he does, but it's related. I'm talking about sustainable yield in terms of connecting to and access to Indigenous cultures or Noongar culture, particularly on the south coast, and particularly in quite a specific area, ancestral country for me, from approximately Cape Rich out a little bit east of Esperance. And I hope that'll become more clear as I'm going through this, why I've chosen that title. And as you may notice, this will be rather a meandering discussion, so feel free to interrupt at any time, particularly those members of the squad, if I forget or overlook certain things. So the other thing about sustainable yield is I think I like the idea that it suggests something about the environment, and as I'm pushing, it's also something about culture and that relationship. And suggestions of harvest, suggestions of profit even, and how we might play with those. I'll be referencing, if not just repeating, some of the bits of what I spoke about a little while ago when I did the destinations and directions little talk. And I'll probably get back to some of this stuff in a few weeks with Matt's conference that he's prepared. That's partly because I'm moving into the ARC thing, Demi Kadatjin May, narrative technologies, and Wirlomin, moorditj-apiny, which is trying to talk about community development of quite a small community and using culture and different technologies as a way of doing that, and on country camps. So what is a repeat is these couple of quotes. Do we need that bit on the edge there on the... How's the frustrations going with this smooth little presentation that I'm putting together here?
You make it okay.
So look, so I've used this before, but this quote and the next one, I'm trying to ricochet between them with what sort of work we are trying to do, I think. This, I think, is talking a lot about the possibilities of identity and belonging on this continent, in this nation. So this is a linguist talking particularly about accessing Indigenous cultural heritages and how they can help us belong differently and might even change how we can think of ourselves. So these, I think these are preoccupations, perhaps anxieties of a settler colony. We're not the only one in the world going through this sort of thing. I like to speak about, forgive me for those of you who heard me say it before, this is Indigenous heritages as a major denomination and a currency of identity and belonging. It's sort of a financial metaphor, deliberately, so we can start thinking about investing in this, so we can start thinking about equity, not just in a financial sense, but equality, social justice, how these things might be, these heritages might be fairly shared, and how you can value add to them through investment of different sorts. The other quote, and so I'm trying to pick a space between these are not mutually exclusive, I hope. And now I'm trying to move to the next one. Linda, what's going on? I'm pressing these arrows.
It's not working.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there we go.
We've gone back to that.
I see. Yeah, I don't know why that was.
My apologies to those of you who might be watching this on screen. So this is a contrary sort of view, really, saying it's not yours, it's ours. It's not to be shared with, it's not to heal or settler colonies' anxieties. I have great sympathy with this position. It's badly referenced. This comes from the Dumbarton website over the road. My sympathies come from the fact that I think there's still a great need for healing of Indigenous communities, for recovery and empowerment. I don't think we can remind ourselves too much that it's stolen country, that across southern Australia it's a minority, some have said 10%, surviving the first 50 years of colonisation. A.O. Neville at the beginning of the 20th century said there's 1,400 Noongars surviving in the southwest. Then there's an apartheid-like regime for most of our shared history. So I've got sympathy with this, and I'm old enough to remember when this, and it still exists in sectors of our society, when these sort of heritages were denigrated when there was attempts at their destruction, let alone in the custodians of those sort of heritages. And I can't help. So when I went through my schooling, when I went to start at university, there was no such niche, if you like, as Aboriginal literature. Very little African literature. When I started studying literature, that was as close as we could get to anything like that. So I can't help but be conscious of that rapid shift to where now, in some circles, in enlightened circles, in fact, it's as if now everybody wants it, and a certain sort of greed for things. So to try and work out that balance is, I think, what part of what motivates me in a lot of work that I'm doing. However, with this sort of thing, this sort of attitude, and particularly when we're talking about story and song, cultural heritage of that sort, it can wither away if it's just locked up, I think. And in fact, it's enhanced often through being shared. I guess the issue is about control of those sharing processes. And that's what I'll try and talk of today, as ways of trying to establish and maintain that sort of control in ways that value add as you go. These are things that a treaty, of course, might address. It's my unfortunate position to be more of a poet or a wannabe poet than a policy maker. So what I'm sharing today is my efforts to try and work in this sort of space between these two different attitudes, if that makes sense. And I'll be talking a little bit about where I'm trying to get in the current ARC project, segueing from a project that's coming to an end, culminating in a presentation, which we call Songlines and the Fits, which I'll now attempt to move to. Very good. You won't be able to read that. It's no big deal, but I'll read it aloud because it's a PR sort of thing. Written to advertise this presentation that we did in September. I don't know if I read it all. Let me just pick out a couple of paragraphs. Paragraph 3, Songlines and the Fits is a presentation by Wirlomin Noongar Language and Stories about healing the connection between people, cultural heritage and country. In a region famous for its remarkable and vulnerable biological diversity and infamous for its colonial history, Wirlomin show how cultural artefacts like language may also blossom in apparently hostile circumstances. Guided by elders, activating both archives and community memory, there's a methodology within that phrase. Wirlomin share the consolidation and enhancement of cultural heritage in ancestral country and suggest how its many manifestations may reach ever-widening circles of audiences while the heart seed remains planted in this precious place right here, nurtured by a new ecology of relationships. It's getting a little flowery there, even I must admit. I was given a draft and I got a little carried away. But there is a method in that, the consolidation, the enhancement, and I'll repeat myself going through this, through ever-widening circles from that centre of consolidation, a home community where there exists trust and where you can bring together fragments of a threatened heritage, I think, and work out ways of sharing that. That's much of what I'll be talking about, really. In the presentation, but this is advertising, where I think, and feel free to interrupt, we had about 140, I think, people in an audience, which is not bad for a little thing like that. We took across about 20 or 30 people in a group, mainly Noongars. And I'll show you a slideshow that Gayleen put together in a moment about this. I just want to reference some of the things so it might make a bit more sense. We got there the day before the presentation. partly so we could claim the space a little bit, the community, Hopetown Community Resource Centre. And since we hoped to do some sort of performance, we could have some sort of rehearsal. We set out chairs, we worked out where we wanted people, the group we'd taken along, the Wirlomin group, where we wanted them sitting, so we weren't all to be huddled in one little sector. We'd be spread out. And then as the presentation went moving, we had those Noongar individuals moving out of the audience and joining me at the front. That was partly to escape the convenience of having some sort of dance, which frankly, and this is my issue and my problem, I often find kind of convenient and condescending in some circumstances. And a little group of us had talked about if we just move around a little bit and do something like move out of the audience up to the front, it'll signal that there's quite a few of us here in this area that's supposedly taboo for Noongar people because of its history. It's not true, but there's certainly very hostile circumstances. We have signalled a return to country as a collective, and we might also, and I think this sort of would unsettle an audience a little and make it a bit inconvenient. They'd be thinking, who's going to get up next? Where, what's going on here? I like to think that was effective. And we had a meal there, talked about what we'd do. Then the next day we had the foyer, if that's how you pronounce that word, set up with some of the books, the 6 books we put together over a decade or so, one of which related to the site where we were. We had some artefacts from the community, the Wirlomin community. We had some artwork by members of the Wirlomin community and there for sale. We had some ochre that we collected in the area that we also used at a little ceremony after the presentation. We had, thank you very much. See the squad here, the deadly squad. We had some videos playing in the foyer. We made up 5 short videos. This comes out of a collaboration with South Coast Natural Resource Management. They wanted us to be supplying traditional ecological knowledge, which again, my own personal issues, I'm a little bit prickly about in the context, particularly in an area like this and in the history that I've already spoken of, when a large part of this heritage has been damaged. And the way I respond, and forgive me for this, is, and now you want us to hand over the few fragments, these tidbits we have left, and you'll fit them into a cultural frame that's created all the problems here. This history of massacre and oppression, this history of over-clearing. However, so we had these videos playing, too much for people to get in one hit, but partly to demonstrate we can supply that stuff if you wish. And then we had, after that, they'd move into the multimedia presentation, bit of performance in there, presentation of a story, couple of songs, and a multimedia presentation at the core of it, very much relying, in this particular example, on the digital mapping skills of Samia Jabor doing a PhD with us. That presentation sort of set the context, the history of the place, something which I've been talking about here, and also tried to bring the story alive in its latter parts as it moved through the landscape, and we were using Noongar language. So a little bit of performance in that aspect of it also. How am I going here, squad? All right. Those videos, which we'll try and look at a little bit in a moment, or a couple of minutes of one of them. In fact, I'll wait till we look at them. We also had the people helping organise this, South Coast Natural Resource Management, said, what about, do some sort of welcome to country to start with? And the way I responded at that point was this whole thing is going to be a welcome to country in a way, is what we hope for, some sort of change gears. But we did also have an introduction to the presentation. I think this is significant, from individuals representing 2 different land councils along the south coast, signalling that the one clan, this Wirlomin group, actually extends across 2 native title bodies, and the boundaries, and this is something about how bureaucracies work, is kind of arbitrarily decided in a way for the convenience of bureaucratic processes by a couple of elders from 2 major families. And we had 2 individuals representing both of those bureaucracies introducing our presentation. I think that's about. Then after the presentation, we had a bus trip to the location referenced in the story and one of the songs we were gifting the local community. So topographical feature. And that was an attempt to try to be strategic. We'd invited some VIPs, as we were calling them, from various bureaucracies, art bureaucracies, land management bureaucracies and so forth, to come along on that bus trip. That's when we showed them the topographical features which connect with the language artefacts. So now maybe in a more casual way, we'll just have a look at this slide show, which is about 5 minutes, which will give you some images of what I've just outlined. There's something.
Is it one of these?
It's not that one. It's whoop. It's that one at the bottom there. Now we'll just be proud of this soundtrack. That's what we could find. A couple of people who helped a lot with setting up Wirlomin as a not-for-profit there. This is showing the artwork, the books. Some of the ochre. There's those 2 screens, the videos we're playing on there. I hope you noticed the seats were empty before we began, and now they're not. At the front, that is. This is the preparation for Leslie. Now, did I mention? I don't think I did. This was at the Ravensthorpe Wildflower Show, and I began with some attempt to draw a metaphor between why people were there. That was to, celebrate these unique and diverse blossomings from poor soil, nutrient lacking soil. And I use that as a metaphor for what we were doing in a very hostile history and an endangered country, to have these cultural blossomings. And what we're offering, we won't offer the story here today, was a story that connects to on that slope there. I'll talk a bit about how we put the story together later, of dogs being transformed into seals swimming back around the coast. So we only gave them 2 locations for this so-called songline. Where we gathered in the bus, with a car park conveniently underneath it, was to look at the head of this Noongar looking down over the slope where the seals have returned to him. We can look at it another time, but it's and there's this, we've recovered in these 15, 20 years, also a song that belongs in that region and have had people singing it. I'll talk more about that process if you'll bear with me in this meandering way. But I'd also like to spend a little time looking at a couple of minutes of one of the videos. You ready, Linda? That I've got here. Not so much for the traditional ecological knowledge, I think that sort of stuff's coming across, but also in terms of things like engagement and capacity raising, which I think is an important part of any sort of Indigenous research that's going on. And also a certain classy aesthetic, I think. So we had, as part of this collaboration with South Coast NRM, and something I'd like to extend on if I can, we had a couple of trainee filmmakers working with a bloke called Frank Ridgevick, who's done quite a few films, working with phones. And what I'm pleased about in this little clip, which is the Noongar moorditj-apiny, and I'll skim through to find a few bits of this, is the way the community members, if I put it like that, are engaging with providing the commentary. So they're asking questions, and then we're having the questions answered to supply the commentary. And there's 2 cameras in this. But again, these are people who haven't done this sort of work before. So I'm hoping to whip it along to about 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Yeah, yeah. And the volume might be an issue, hey? So this is cooking kangaroo tails, which
How long you leave me for, Pop?
is one of those questions.
25 minutes. 25, 30 minutes. I mean, ready.
I'll take it forward a bit. You can look at these later if you're lucky. These will end up on our website. I think it's about here somewhere.
Why are you covering him up for?
Another one of those questions.
Why are you covering him up, Pop? That's it. Yeah, that's him. Open grave. Yeah, cover it up. Yeah. We do it wrong. It's still can't get hard. We got sleep.
What are you doing now?
Well, I'm gonna take a sit down there and we can get into it. Why you didn't look at take the action to water. This is the yellow hey, look, my finger was flooded. Yep. Make you up. Oh, it's beautiful, Chris. Make a gap for 20 well. Yep. He made the jumper. Somebody put the finger there. Where y'all going? Younger, you want them math. Younger or? Well, no, Gilbert. Over. What you want to back out here for it? You know, you shoes here. Shows on the shoes. Oh, camera, not part of it. Oh, yeah. Camera, you find that. Yeah. Go find that in the camera. Get these.
I was waiting to get guys' questions in. Voices too. So leave it there. What I wanted, I like the sort of aesthetic that early on, I don't know if we noticed, there's ashes blowing to one of the cameras. I'm really impressed myself with the way community or family, clan around there put those questions in and that sense of an audience. I think this matters in terms of capacity raising and cultural recovery. They're partly thinking of the younger fellas in the group and that could be an audience for this sort of work rather than delivering it to a bureaucracy. But they're also starting to, I know in the performance of our central man there, Fred Roberts, he's thinking of an audience watching this on a camera. I think I wanted to go up to, he mentions, let me just give me a few more seconds.
Yeah, this way you take it forward. Get the views of the tax one.
You've got 30 seconds. Give me that, please.
Is the skin still on it?
When they're cooking it, yeah. When it's cooked.
Oh, yeah, he's got me to the market room. He's got market room.
That's what I wanted. So they're anticipating a wider audience as well. The cultural hybridity that comes out of this, but it's Noongar stuff at the centre of it. That's what I'm really interested in terms of identity and belonging and empowerment and transformation and so on. So again, I haven't really got on top of how to talk about this yet. I thought, anybody else want to talk for a while or ask questions or something? Because I thought what I might move to, and I've talked about this at some length, so again, forgive me repeating myself, is how this sort of, talk about how the stages in getting to what's a culmination of quite a long time to get to be doing a presentation like this on country and returning as a group to ancestral country and gifting a regional community some sense of potential identity and belonging that is quite different from wheat belt or mining or trying to fix up over-cleared country. So if we can get back to the PowerPoint, Linda, thank you very much. We'll have to work on how to make this more theatrical here.
I'll try and ask a question if you want.
Yeah, I'd like some questions. Yeah, that helps me feel like I'm
Right. I'm just thinking as you're talking and saying that you haven't quite figured out how to talk about this. I'm interested to hear more about that, like especially around what you said at the start of, how to kind of frame what you want to do in terms of like finance, language, and the value, what you said, the cultural heritage is value, or kind of value adding, and I'm interested in that tension and kind of the politics of that framework, or describing the value of what we're trying to do.
Oh, it looks part of just trying to be glib, find some lines. I like that. I like the major denomination in the currency of identity and belonging, because I think that's what a settler colony is after. And I'm, as I've said, I'm really concerned about such a rapid shift, trying to get rid of it. Now everybody wants it, and who's going to miss out in those processes, and how much that perpetuates the power relationship that's characteristic of Australia. And as someone who's privileged and because of the scholarly skills or whatever, and also being gifted some of this cultural heritage from elders to whom I'm obliged and responsible. I worry about the Noongars that'll be missing out if we're not careful. So that's a large part of why I use that. Another phrase I use is the paradox of empowerment through giving, which I'll get to in a moment through going through these processes. But it relies on I think it relies on this control, and that things not being taken and stolen, but gifted, like we do in creative practice, as I think about it. But this is more than creative practice. So I can't quite work out how to talk it, and it's not. And often one gets hijacked or ambushed by sort of political or policy sort of rhetoric in this space, which doesn't always do justice to it, I think. I'm trying to talk up, creative practices, but in an ethical sort of way. For a settler colony, many of us are I think it's difficult to articulate this, if you can supply what that white audience needs. As an individual, there's a lot of temptation to jump on that treadmill and do it. And so how do we fairly allow ourselves to be, expressing ourselves as individuals and not ripping off our community, the other members, just through that cleverness? How do we value add? How do we consolidate? And in my experience, which I'll try and hit, I think it's about you build on where there's trust. This is what feels important to me. It's not necessarily driven by academic concerns, where there's trust and something like spirit. And I think this is the case with Wirlomin. You try and build on that, and that connects to ancestral tradition, I think, very much. And then you try and consolidate that around that trust and get a drip feed going. So some of it's going out to wider audiences, but then that circle comes back again. So maybe I'll carry on, because I'm not doing a good job here, I think. That's the advertisement. The slideshows give you an idea of the presentation. Today I'm not going to do the story or the songs, I'm just talking around them. Much of this began, and this is from a previous lecture, with Hazel Brown, who's no longer with us, entrusting me and a few other people with what she knew. This is just, I've cut words out of a few pages. She'd made 500 words, sitting next to her dad in his latter years, just trying to write down words from ways he was talking and her own distinctive spelling. The second word in the list, portbalket, is the word for seal, from port, do it, when you say, bal, tar, dog, his head. So it begins there. It begins also with public archival stuff, though we, Wirlomin, are part of a protocol since about 2006 to be important part of the protocol of who can access this. This is, again, a story. This has got that same word in it, twerk. International Phonetic Alphabet, collected 1930s in Albany. Name of the fellow at the top, George Nelly. That's him there. Not taken at quite that time. He died when his children were very young. So this is part of the process. This is not to establish cultural brokers, but it's just to be respectful and also build on that trust and try and get back to what's the centre of this story in this instance. Here's a group of people from, I think, 2006, when we first started to gather around what Auntie Hazel and a couple of her siblings wanted us to try and build up, and some of this public archival stuff from the linguist like Gerhard Laves. Russell Nelly and Helen Nelly at the centre of this group in this particular photo. They're the children of George Nelly, who left this story to the linguist in 1930. We started the story with the kids there, George's story with Russell and Ian. But in fact, it was too volatile, and because they didn't know their dad, in fact, hadn't heard those stories that brought up all the issues of them being separated from the family, brought up in another Aboriginal nation, not knowing their own ancestral language, but knowing that other one. And here we were starting to bring their dad's story alive, thanks to the International Phonetic Alphabet and a bunch of elders sitting around buying in, as some of us were attempting to read the words from paperwork, which is what you see here. Me and Iris Woods, Hazel Brown in the foreground there, starting to work on this George Nelly story. And we recorded all our arguments and discussion in doing this. Again, Auntie Hazel, pretty central to these processes. And other youngsters gathered around behind this sort of front circle of people in the conversation. So this is about repatriation, if you like, returning this material to its centre. Then we move to draft copies of the story, and we shared that with the wider Noongar community in Albany. So this is a presentation from there with a photo of the fellow that left this story with us. The artwork produced by his daughter, Auntie Ying, Helen Nelly, Helen Hall. The story co-written with his son, Russell Nelly, and a group of us, but him being named as part of that. Here's Auntie Ying at a further step in widening these circles, presenting at a school. So we then go and present at schools and community events. So that's widening this circle and this sense of audience. Took her a week before she'd speak. So we'd go with a group, some of us a little bit more accustomed to working with groups, and elders with us, in this case, Auntie Ing and Uncle Russell, and a few youngsters getting ready to step in when they feel the inclination. But Auntie Ing, not accustomed to this sort of public stuff at all, as I say, it took her a week. And then a couple of the other elders told her she better lift the game, otherwise she was going to get left behind. Now I want to read out the quotes. If I brought that book along, is that book around somewhere? That Tort Polkut book? I did have it with me. So I'll paraphrase them. Yeah, look, I thought I brought it with me, but obviously not. So we have Russell Nelly, Connie Moses, Iris Woods, Jason Miniter talking about how tentative they felt going into schools and these community presentations. Shame I can't use their exact words, but my fault, my flaw. And then being tentative, being unsure of themselves, and then being really proud of one another as a group and of themselves and of the response they were getting from kids in the school, having, you know, the minority of Noongar kids wanting to join in, add what they knew, recognising people in the photos who did the story and the process, and that sense of being able to carry on and rebuild tradition. So those quotes I was going to take from the back of the book of this story. I'll continue on. That's the book itself, which is, so this is published in 2013, I think. So it's about 5 years or more to get the book to publication. And then it's taken us, whatever it is, 2013 to 2022, to get to reconnecting it with country. So there's a fair bit of work involved in that as well, which ancestral country being over-cleared. Million Acres a Year is a wonderful film about this same area. Being infamous for massacre, that's Coconera Memorial to the historical massacre at the edge of Ravensthorpe, which Wirlomin were a part of, but only a subset of the community connected with all of this event. Ronnie Forrest, Carol Pedersen from the Nat family, and Harley Coyne were very instrumental in getting all this happening. But we as Wirlomin have also visited the so-called massacre homestead where the killings originated. And so there's quite a story behind all this. But again, 20 or 30 of us went onto the homestead. This is into taboo country, so-called taboo country. I would argue that it's taboo not only because of the killings, but also then legislation, 1905 legislation particularly, meant you couldn't get back onto country. You couldn't go into little towns. You're locked away in reserves. So it's impossible to get back to reconcile yourself to what had happened there, except for a minority of people. The 1901 police book names 10 individuals, I think, Noongar individuals living in Ravensthorpe. This is within 10, 20 years of the killings that began, the continual killings. One of them, Billy Nelly, in the family of this story that we're talking about, returning there. So Wirlomin as a group go back and confront this sort of history, talk to the people that own the homestead associated with us. Gifted again, as part of dealing with the guilt and victimhood and this sort of stuff, have some, and we've got all this on film. This is part of the archive that I want to organise and work with. Some serious truth-telling conversations between the owners of the homestead who bought it in the 60s, but feel bad about the association of their place, and Arnie Hazel trying to get a story together. And we couldn't resolve it, not surprisingly, in that time. But we were confronting it and getting back on country as a collective and as a group. They gifted us 26 grinding stones, which was quite a speech they made. This is a very informal gathering, but very on the ground stuff. I now want to play, if I can. I'm going on a long time. We right? Keep going. Couple of, again, archival stuff from, I think, more than 10 years ago that again, I want to try and how to work with the home community with this stuff, organise it, where we've got, yes, this one, and then I'll have to whip through it.
And we found.
So this is on the homestead. I want to whip through, if I can check my notes here.
What do you call them? Drawings. Now,
To
all
about
these
20.
stones come from the coast down at the Hammersley.
So I'll just go back and this is that's it's an old water hole on site. I want to get up there. This is Russell. This is a reading story at a water hole down that sad story. Here. I should have edited it all.
That's welcome. No. This is right. In the brother's country, and he made us welcome. I want the Wirlomin tribe to know and to read this story to us as it's so precious. And Wirlomin tried to read that story for us. I thank him that we got our own family who could do it for us. Thank you.
For us to come in today has been a privilege. And on behalf of my sister and the families, we extend our thank you to my brother for permission to be here. And I can't help but think in the history books, we read accounts of it's been shown arsenic and things in the water. People say that's like a pigment of imagination. But it's a cold hard fact that it happened. And to be here with the Wirlomin family, one of the things that my sister after discussions with Kim and the members of the family is this. We'd like to hear some of our stories being read back to us through the family participation. And that in itself had authenticity to the whole project. So that we know we got something positive here, we got something beautiful. In spite of what happened a long time ago, in spite of the years that passed, we had remnants of our proud tribe that existed right through this land for us to be for me still. I feel very privileged and I'm thinking, what you want to say?
Stop there. Back to the PowerPoint. Linda, please. Yeah, so thanks for letting me ramble on so long. We've only a little bit to go. So they're talking there about that story from their father that we value added to through cross-referencing with other little pockets of knowledge of an endangered heritage that's almost gone. It's politically difficult to say these things. Cross-referencing that through groups, through a small circle where there's trust, expanded out through that publication process. The book is only a book. Kind of hard for me to say that's what I care about. It's only a vehicle for whatever else goes, the really important stuff that goes on in stories. That's the ineffable sort of thing. Spreading it out back again and then reconnecting, using a story to reconnect people, bring people together, build on that trust and reconnect it with country. Other things we're doing in that process, as I said, confronting history, visiting the massacre sites. This is on the homestead. There was a bit of a film we clipped over. So again, this is part of an archive collected since we formed as Wirlomin and Noongar Language and Stories most of this century. But there's also, within this little plan of trust, there's also footage back to the 1980s, and there's photos, there's language materials that it would be, seems to me, it'd be worthwhile attempt to try and get that together and organise them and have individuals in that community engaging with it, activating it so you can build it up further. And then that's what I would think of as something like sovereign data, to have that sort of control and decide on some sort of drip feed out to those wider parts of the circles. But with a collective that's got a handle on that material, rather than just one or two of us as brokers running out there to appease, settler colony anxieties and desires. And this is sort of what I mean by paradox of empowerment through giving. It needs the control part of it first. I think it's not led by theory. This is a sort of intuitive and accumulated experience, and then trying to keep it going. So here's a site this is on the Massacre homestead, and going to, you can't see it in the photo, but there's a little group of men trusting one another to old water holes where you still slide the slab off over the cover of it, and you can't help but think of ancestors doing this same sort of thing. So I think there's great symbolic, poetry in that, I think, thinking about what that means. Even more so, this is a lovely thing about Mr. Henry Dabb, who's in the background there with the arrow over him. When we got those grinding stones given to us, Uncle Henry said, I'll keep two of them. And he, strategically thinking, said, we'll lend some of these to the local historical society. And I guess he was meaning we'll get a relationship going there. But we didn't do that. None of us noticed that he hadn't delivered on that idea. 6 months later, when we went back to this place where there's this Nama hole and you slide the slab off, we're doing that again, and he said to one in the group, put your hand into the water then. I think there's something there. And they pulled out one of the grinding stones that he'd left there. And seems to me, that's how you create ceremony, through things like that. That he was arguing, we don't take it away, we leave it on country. And that sense of connection with the heritage is again what you try and build up in these processes. This is back to the advertisement for the Songlines and Fitz gig. This is the site, East Mount Barron. There's some irony in the Barron Ranges where we're doing this sort of work. I think it's the head of the Noongar man waiting for his dogs to come back as seals. These are the seals in the lower part of the slope. There's more to talk about with this. Some of these clips that I've shown here were also in the presentation that Samuel was instrumental in putting together. Were in that presentation, some of these shots here, to talk about the context before we led into the story. It's a close-up of the head. And I'll pick up another discussion where I'll finish this one, maybe in a month or so. That head is looking out over, as this says, the wave-cut bench on the seaward side of East Mount Barron is one of the most botanically significant areas in the Fitzgerald River National Park and the South Coast. What else is he looking out over? He's looking out over this history. He's looking out over a group of people doing this work, descendants of his in a way, you'd like to say, and controlling how it's shared for the betterment of everyone living there, a different sense of identity and belonging. So that's what if possible, in my badly organised fashion, as you've seen here, with film clips that have not been edited to fit in here, having trouble with the technology, leaving the books behind with the quotes on. points to the need for some organisation, but I think there's a lot of value in trying to organise that archive and getting individuals in this community connected with it, engaging with it, and building it up like those two trainees were with those films that we made, like that community was around that fire. What other voices do we need? How do we build up the discourse around this sort of material? Community archive, technologies, story, song, on country, and an effort to consolidate and share it in expanding and then reducing circles in the interest of strengthening that community. That's about what I thought I'd talk about here today. I hope I've done that adequately. We don't need to use the whole hour and a half, I guess. I'll leave there. Thank you, Gabby.
I had a question about the actual title of your event, which was Songlines and Fits, and why are you kind of setting on the Fits, which is the settler?
Yeah, you're partly that, but partly the Fits, huh?
Yeah, it's good.
What does that say? You know, barren ranges, Starvation Harbour, Mount Disappointment, Lake Misery. You know. Jay Arthur has written a book, I think, about the language of the default country. I mean, this is part of what motivates dual naming, I think. Talking about English is the language of the default country. It doesn't belong here, it doesn't connect. What does river mean? When you talk about, is it the Todd River in Alice Springs? It's never on the surface. What about these rivers on the south coast that infrequently reach the sea? They're often just a series of pools. So there is a part of the identity and belonging that's nascent, I think, in multiple Indigenous heritages. I happen to care about this one. So Songlines and the Fits is a bit to hint at that. In my mind, it's sort of a little bitter, in fact, in my mind, but that's the vernacular is the Fits. That's how we all talk about it. Songlines, I think that comes from Bruce Chapman and it's a little problematic anyway, but it's also entered the vernacular. So it was partly to signal those, and I thought it would. And I thought it was a bit like an advertisement as well. There's a contrast, however inaccurate or otherwise songlines might be, but the Fits would signal that sort of thing, and which I tried to signal in the copy with that little advert thing for it as well.
You name all those negative English names, those really depressive English names. It feels like a bitterness in a way that why were they colonising this place that they seem to have such bad feelings about? It seems awful in a way when you consider the destruction.
Yeah, I think it's discomfort. I think there's a conference coming up with that title, isn't there? I think it's you call it colonisation. It's probably about conquest and greed and things like that, isn't it? And then I think it's when you get here, the colonisers are here, and it's an awkward fit. It's where you get your Starvation Harbour and Lake Misery. Barren Ranges comes from Flinders, going along coast, just looking at and saying it looks very barren, which it does from distance, I guess.
In the data that linguist in the recordings that he did of the Nellie's dad, was it just around that one story, or was there
There's
trying
lots.
to record a language?
There's
Trying
lots.
to do a grammar of a language?
A bit of grammar in there, yeah.
So are there other stories?
There's other stories there, yeah. I don't like to dwell too much on the linguist because it becomes a narrative of saviour, and I am very grateful that he did that work, which then stayed in the United States till late 20th century, came back here. Then there was I had to set up a community protocol, which we were part of, which is a lot of, and Arnie Hazel was very instrumental in finding descendants of those informants. Sometimes I show a group of elders instrumental in starting a lot of this up. only Hazel at their centre, the siblings and first cousins, and they're all, there's a lot were children of those informants and grandchildren, that sort of thing. But again, it's heritage that belongs to all Noongars of the South Coast. We don't do this to say we are the bosses of it and we own it. We do it as part of taking responsibility and build where the trust is first. So a very non-bureaucratic and policy way of going about things, but that's the way it goes, and I think there's good value in it. I think I've been talking.
I just wonder if there's plans for more work, just
Oh, absolutely.
more from that offset.
Yeah, to do this was partly strategic, to signal benefits of joint management of the national park, really, and to signal the benefits of working with Noongar, and maybe to slow some things down, even like the rush to dual naming. When people, it's good things in that, but maybe it sometimes can go so quick if you're not respectful enough of where the language and the names are coming from. I think I've gone on. I can talk forever. Thank you, Cass, for helping out.
I know, so yeah, there are 6 books that have come out, and this project is 2 pages in one of the books, and the books are 16 double-page spreads, and so it's just so much work to share it the right way. So this has been a connection between a landscape, the story, the descendants, and the song. So it's a cross section of 4 things that have come together, and there is a lot of work to do, but it has to be at the pace of community, and community occurs at the pace of relationship building. And so as researchers, we have to kind of find that balance between, we feel like we have this prerogative as researchers to get good information out all the time, but that's actually not the pace of community. And that Kim talks about the real hunger for these stories as a kind of balm for settler colonial feelings. We're very much in the beginnings of those conversations. We don't have the answers to that. These are these words we use, settler colonial. And that might be a different word we use in 50 years' time. But these stories have to maintain a kind of connection to community to retain their framing. Kim talks about the framing being taken over by bureaucracy, conservation language, government language. So that the pace has to be slow, but there's also like a grief that comes with it, that you're encountering your own culture that is fragmented, and our community members who can be healed by it. So we wish we could do it faster. And so it's not easy territory, because it's not, a lot of academia is kind of ideas and concepts separated from place or people, but that's not the space that we're in.
It's real cliches, it's relationships, it's reciprocity, it's respect. I think that's part of what the mix is. And it's very powerful. We don't need to rush it along. So part of the ARC thing, the Demi Kadatjin May, which is a quote from a song that belongs where this head is. The old people always understand you. Whatever new cultural products you run with is what the song's partly talking about. Part of that is to organise this material and help equip people to be healed, who are connected to it, healed by it, and to share it in ways which transform relationships, the empowerment through giving. So when we're in a situation like that, delivering this material, who's, for those framed moments, who's got the power, who's in charge, and it's Noongars. It doesn't last, that's the reality of things, but it's a step towards widening that possibility, I think. And it's wonderful as descendants, just a little bit, over the top. It's a fact, just I can't express to you how wonderful it is to be going back onto ancestral country, you know, regaining a heritage with the enormous power there that Gamage talks about in the biggest estate on earth, or whatever it's called, talks about a culture that created abundance so that there was time for spirituality and creativity. That's what we're starting to tap back into. In moments of first contact along the south coast, when Lockyer first arrived at Albany to grab it as a military outpost, a colony, he was met by a Noongar who shook his hand and spoke to him in French. That's a truth. How about that as cross-cultural sophistication and leaping out of any little traps about the inferiority or, you know, lack of culture and civilization. And there's an enormous, when you start looking at first contact stuff, very difficult to articulate it when we are ambushed and hijacked by Gallipoli and military history to talk about the nature of first contact, the generosity and talent and inclusivity of Noongar people before that was all deeply betrayed within a few short years. You know, it's incomprehensible at the moment, the possibility tapping into that sort of power. All the little, all the little anecdotes from first contact. Salvador talks about a Noongar bloke, a kid, watching someone knitting. I can't remember the time, for half an hour or so, and then picks up the knitting needles and knits. Hey, what the? Imagine, what culture delivers on those sort of things? When we think about dual naming, there's a Noongar text from the south coast. Demanga manga, my old people. Born Miyak, let's see. Demanga manga, Kicho, Mea, born Warrabin, King Georgetown. There's a colonial place name carried within the Noongar cultural frame, saying, me and my old people, our eyes spearing through the bush, from here to where things are becoming bad at King Georgetown. So once, you know, accessing this sort of culture, it's not only it's the currency of identity and belonging, what that means deeper than a settler colony, but all the power that's there as well. You wouldn't want to hand it over in tidbits of traditional ecological knowledge as far as I'm concerned. You carry the story and the songs which give you a hint at the way of being in the landscape. And as I said, in that flowery promotional material, a new ecology of relationships. That's what's sort of latent, I think, in this sort of work. But you know, that's also talking it up to try and justify it in a context like this, rather than doing it, just going along doing it. It's probably about it. I don't know. I can talk underwater once I get like all of this.
I've got another question.
Thank you.